Hello and welcome to the 13th video interview, which is part of the series ECMI Conversations with Experts. Each episode, we invite a prominent expert in the field of minority studies to discuss a specific topic with one of the ECMI researchers. My name is Kyriaki Topidi, and I am a senior researcher at the ECMI, and I am delighted today that I can talk to Giulia Evolvi from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam about the connection between minorities with digital religion. So welcome, Giulia, and thank you. Giulia got her MA in Religious Studies from the University of Padua in Italy and her PhD in Media Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she was affiliated with the Center for Media, Religion and Culture. Giulia then did a postdoc at the Center for Religious Studies at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany, and is currently employed as lecturer in media and communication at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. In 2024, Giulia has exciting plans and will be working as a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Bologna, Italy, where she will explore social media, gender, and religion. So it is a true pleasure to welcome you. I will jump immediately into our topic in order to take advantage of your presence with us today and ask you to, first of all, explain a little bit to us what is understood and described under the term of digital religion.
So digital religion is a theoretical approach that is used to talk about how religious groups and religious individuals use the internet to create narratives, discuss their beliefs, and in general get in contact to each other. Now, there are various perspectives to study religion and the internet, and in general religion and media. It's worth noting that at the very beginning of the internet, or at least at the diffusion of the internet some 25 years ago, there was this idea that religion online was sort of like a separate realm, a separate sphere than everyday interactions. So there were studies about the so-called online religion as something completely separate what happened offline. But nowadays, with the perspective of digital religion, we are more and more looking at how everyday activities are mediated online. And this is connected with the fact that, especially in places like Europe or North America, people tend to be online all the time. We have smartphones, we have iPhones that provide us so many different services and also help us with our spiritual lives. So every religious community, every religious authority needs somehow to take into account also the power of communication of the internet. And we cannot really talk about a religious phenomenon that is entirely online or entirely offline, but rather every form of contemporary religion has some sort of influence with the online sphere.
Okay, so I take it from you that the offline and the online obviously become blended. Would you be able to explain to us through examples, if possible, how that happens, and if also possible, why it does happen in that way? And we can no longer completely neatly separate the two worlds as was initially
Well, something that is well established in religion and media as a field in general is that religion has always been to a certain extent mediated. So religions need communication venues because otherwise they would not be able to put people in contact or create communities. Nowadays, most of contemporary communication is somehow also mediated online. That doesn't mean that other media forms no longer exist, but it means that religious authorities, the religious leaders have to make the conscious choice of using or not using the internet. Clearly, there are some groups who decided to not use the internet at all, or to use the internet in a selective manner. There is an excellent study of Heidi Campbell, who is one of the pioneers of digital religion, about the so-called kosher phone in Israel, where some rabbis and other religious authorities work together with technological experts to create smartphones that can only connect to certain sites that are considered quote-unquote kosher. So this is an example of how religions consciously decide to use only certain aspects of technology.
Mhm.
But in a way or the other, this negotiation of the use of technology and sort of like going online is something that all religious communities have to do at a certain point.
Mhm.
A classical example that we have seen very prominently was during COVID-19. During COVID-19, many religious communities did not have a choice. And I, for instance, studied how some Italian Catholic churches, Catholic parishes, decided to live stream the masses and then put it on Facebook and create a space of engagement with believers. In that case, of course, it was because they did not have other choices, but it sort of like shows how the space of the church remained the same. So the mass was actually performed in a church, and it remained exactly the same as it would have been an offline mass. But at the same time, it was mediated online and created spaces of interaction through, for instance, Facebook pages or YouTube comments that did not exist before the internet. So we see how the online and the offline sphere become blended in the sense that they create something new, but it also continue to be based on the understanding of religion, on the traditional religious values, and on traditional functions, masses, or other religious gatherings that already happen. So in a way it changes, but on the other, more than a radical change, according to the perspective of digital religion, is a negotiation of what is preserved offline, what it goes online, and the fact that religious individuals and communities now exist most of the time, both offline and online.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Can I just try to dig a little bit deeper in a specific direction and ask you if, to the best of your empirical and theoretical knowledge, there are particular ways or particular methods that religious minorities, but also, you know, majority communities use to create meaning through media narratives? Have you observed something that suggests a certain, you know, tendency in a way?
Yeah, so there are several others, several ways and several meanings. And I also would like to get a little bit more in depth in talking about religious minorities, because clearly a religious majority, it's of course always hard to define what is a majority and what is a minority. But right, if we take something established like the Vatican, okay, the online mediation is usually a mirroring of the offline experience. I'm using the Vatican because I think it's the easiest example here. So the Vatican always used media. Already when television became popular, the Vatican Mass started to be broadcasted every Sunday. So in this sense, there is nothing new in the mediation of Catholicism. And of course, when Twitter started to become popular, the Pope also started a Twitter account. Same got for Instagram. And those are strategies that are somehow in line with the strategies of communication that use the so-called mainstream media. So as the Vatican would broadcast the Mass on public television or use the public radio, they would then at the same time create a Pope account on Twitter to tweet regularly what the Pope thinks about current events or in general sentences of wisdom and religious messages. And at the same time, Instagram is used to channel certain images and certain events to the believers. So those strategies are pretty much consistent. So the internet creates new possibilities, but the type of discussions and the type of messages remain largely the same. And also the communication is more or less the same. This is different when you talk about religious minorities. And of course, I consider minorities as religions that are not predominant in a country or in a context, but also religions that somehow do not have access to the public sphere. They do not have access to public discourses. So talking about my own native country, Italy, and talking about the Vatican, so Catholicism in Italy is very well established. They do have airtime on public television and public radios, But other religions don't really have much space to discuss their own beliefs and their own activities on public television or radio or public newspapers. Also, some religions, such as specifically Islam, tend to have a negative coverage when it comes to news. So clearly, the strategies of those minority religions needed to be slightly different. And usually it's here with minority religions where the internet really gets an important role. Because when a group does not have access or does not have an easy access to the so-called mainstream or traditional media, then the internet can really give different spaces of representation. And depending on the needs of a certain group, the internet can give different possibilities. So there are apps where people can find information about sacred text or messages from religious authorities. There are blogs or forums, those are a bit older, where people can actually interact with each other and form communities. But there are also, and we see that with the more visual media, such as Instagram or YouTube, places where someone can sort of like go online and discuss their own understanding of religion and sort of like discuss that with others. So it's while all religious groups use the internet to a certain extent, it's really necessary for minority religions to use the internet when they do not have access to other forms of expression, or they do not have the representation they wish within the public sphere.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Do you have an overview of, as you observe this phenomena, particularly from the minoritized or minority perspective, what are the most commonly used online tools by digital minorities at this moment, currently, contemporarily?
Yes, so there are several, well, mostly social media, I would say, in the contemporary landscape. And it really depends by the scope of the group, but also of the age and status of the members. And I would like just to open a parenthesis and saying that what I'm going to say, it's also true for other groups that are not necessarily religious, because the use of online tools also depends on age, accessibilities, and the type of message that people want to convey, right? So in my own PhD, which I started more than 10 years ago now, I focus on religious blogs. And at that time, blogs and forums were particularly prominent because they gave people a way of discussing their own faith at length. And also there was a comment section where it was also possible to enter into discussion. Now, while they still exist, now there are new tools that are more visual, more immediate, easily spread through circulation and retweeting and reposting. So that makes it a little bit more attractive for everybody, including religious minorities. Now, if we talk about, however, different generations, people that are a little bit older tend to use Facebook a bit more, right? There was a project which I was involved with in Italy, which is called I Santi Internauti, which basically means the internet saints, which did a lot of studies on Facebook pages. And they discovered that actually we were discussing in an online event last year how the Facebook is still very valuable because it helps people create a community. Like you can create Facebook pages with people that have a similar interest. And especially for people who are slightly older and are more used to Facebook than other platforms, this continues to be very valuable. And also for the exchange of information. So we can find in migrant societies, and of course, a lot of migrants might also belong to a minority religion, that Facebook is very valuable to be part of a group and discover information and share experiences, connect with other people and so forth. But then younger people tend to use things that are a bit more visual, such as TikTok or Instagram. There's a project that was carried on at the University of Vienna, and I was also involved with that, which is called the UBeyond, and it just finished. That actually studied how young people talk about religion and specifically focused on platforms such as Instagram, and looked also at how, for instance, religious influencers would talk about their religion. And most of them were also from minority groups, and they would create visuals and informal discussions so others would follow them. So the concept of influencer is something that actually also applies to minority religions, especially when it comes to young people. They might not have a formal religious education, or they might not be actual leaders, but they can create a content that others would follow. And then finally, talking about online tools, Twitter remains prominent, especially for the creation of hashtag and when it comes to activism. So I'm thinking here of a study of a colleague and friend, Ruth Surya from the United States, who studied this hashtag, which is called Empty the Pew, which was basically a hashtag used by Protestant evangelical people who would be critical of the political stances of churches, for instance, regarding abortion or homosexuality or racism. So basically, they wanted their churches to become more progressive and more open to others. And in this case, they used this hashtag to express their discontent on Twitter and also to create a community. So in this case, it's not a permanent community, but is rather an example of religious and political activism going together. And for this, Twitter is very good. So all in all, it's not that a particular religion would use a particular tool, but depending on whether people want to create more community or want to do something more visual, or they want to engage in activism, there are various platforms that can be relevant.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful and very, very, very actual. Now, I would like to briefly turn to something that's slightly more theoretical. Now, a very important part, or at least a relatively important part of your work in theoretical terms refers to hypermediation. And I was wondering if you could spend a little bit of time to explain to us what hypermediation is and how it works within the frame of digital religion.
Yes, so hypermediation is a theory that I have been elaborating, and not only myself, actually, but several scholars have been elaborated to make sense of contemporary internet use, but also of contemporary digital religion. So this connects well with the previous question. As I was discussing, different platforms can serve different demographic, but also different purposes. Of course, most religious groups, and this is both majority and minority religions, would use more than one platform. So there might be, for instance, influencers that are mainly on Instagram, but most religious communities that tend to have a presence that is on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on other platforms, right? And this is actually a general tendency, not only for religions, but several social or cultural groups would use more than one platform depending on the kind of message that they want to come across. Now, this forces us as scholars sort of like rethink existing theories to account for a type of mediation that does not happen just through one single channel, one single medium, but actually spread around, in this case, the different platforms. So the idea of hypermediation has been elaborated, for instance, by Spanish scholar Carlos Scolari, who draws from the classical theory of mediation, which is an established theory in media studies, and sort of like proposes to add the prefix hyper to sort of like stress the idea of circulation of messages and intensification of mediation. So hypermediation is something that methodologically and theoretically invites us to look at how people or groups, in this case, we can talk about minority religious groups, use multiple platforms simultaneously, in a fast and quick way, spread messages throughout the internet, and in general, intensify the types of communication and relations, because, of course, the more platforms are used, the more messages are circulated, and the more also there will be interactions. So to give an example of that, I will use a work I have published some years ago about a group of French Muslims who started a hashtag called Nous sommes unis, we are united, in response to the terrorist attacks that have been that occurred in Paris and other French cities starting from 2015. Of course, this is an issue of minority religions, not only because Muslims in France are a minority, of course, in numerical terms, but also because at that time, but also not only in France, but throughout Europe, there was a very negative portrayal of Islam, because Islam in the so-called mainstream news was sort of like considered as a problematic religion and connected to terrorism. Now, a group of young Muslims that was an association of Muslim students in France was disturbed by this representation, and they wanted to make clear that they had nothing to do with terrorism. Plus, that they also suffered those terrorist attacks because they did consider themselves as being fully French. Most of them were born in France, and they were completely educated and culturally part of the French nation. So they did create this hashtag called Nous sommes unis. And I'm talking about this example to discuss hypermediation because the hashtag became really popular really fastly throughout the various platforms. It started with a YouTube video, and then it was spread on Twitter. And then it started also to be discussed in various internet platforms. And then a website was created to sort of like give a voice and collect the experiences of young Muslims. Also, it became an interfaith effort because the interfaith associations also spread this hashtag in terms of like solidarity with the young Muslims who were particularly targeted with hate and Islamophobia after the terrorist attacks. And this hashtag also became prominent when it was picked by French and international newspapers and news channels, and was talked about as sort of like an example of how Muslims were responding to the events. So we see here how to understand this phenomenon, we cannot really look at the mediation in a single platform or a single video or a single narrative, but rather a very much complex network of narratives that also put together different actors. So it were young French Muslims, but also Muslims from other countries who used the hashtag to sort of like support what was happening to French Muslims, but also people from other faiths that, including atheists, that wanted to have a voice in the matter. And the representations of the hashtags that spanned from videos, pictures, tweets, websites, so narratives of different length, and including or non-including visual and movie elements. So we can see how it was really complex. And the theory of hypermediation really wanted to discover how we can make sense of this complexity, and also studying what's going on beyond a single platform and through the connections of the internet with offline events. So what's happening in everyday experiences, but also the connections between the internet and the so-called traditional media that continue to be very relevant.
So that's a very useful example, especially because the next question I wanted to bring forward was to what extent you think the digital religion is a field prone to reveal social inequalities? Because as you rightly said, a good number of these communities and groups, which are by no means, harmonized or uniform, do also have a very particular sociolegal, socioeconomic positionality, and they are marginalized. So in what ways, in your experience, digital religion reveals these kinds of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think that digital religion as a field really looks at social inequalities, or at least at relations of power that happen online. So the idea that the internet, of course, gives a voice to marginalized people is something particularly important for the field of digital religion. And there is a book which just came out, and I also have a chapter of it in it, which is called The Third Spaces of Digital Religion, which was edited by Stuart Hoover and Nabila Shaibi. And the idea of the third space is actually directly taken from post-colonial theory and scholars such as Homi Bhabha, among others. And the idea that the internet can function as a third space. So not, of course, the entire internet can give rise to religious spaces, but that there are certain platforms, certain spaces, certain internet venues where people can come together and discuss their religiosity in between online and offline experiences, but also in a way that can create sort of like alternative and resistant ways of discussing religion. So for that book, for instance, I studied some websites dedicated to neo-paganism, which is a new religious movement that also is minoritarian and can be marginalized because in many cases is not recognized or not taken serious as in religious groups because it's really not systematized. So this perspective wants to put emphasis on the fact that online religious spaces can be hybrid when it comes to religious groups, and therefore religious groups can have more possibilities of discussing their own experiences, also when they are not completely established or not completely recognized outside of the internet venues. And of course, this doesn't mean that the internet, as I started with the example of the Vatican, it doesn't mean that more established religions don't use the internet. But the field of digital religion really looks at those venues that are that have the potential of creating something slightly new, something interesting, something even subversive, or that resist mainstream authority. Because this is really when we can find the evolution of religion, where we can find new types of religiosity. And therefore, I would say that the field of digital religion in itself is really interested in the creation of meaning by people, but also of meanings that are not mainstream within society. So in that sense, it's really interesting as a perspective, even if digital religion is not solely and only about minority groups, there definitely is a very big interest in how minority religions use the internet.
That's extremely important because you see a lot of the things that connect religious minorities with the fact that they are minorities is essentially issues of voice, issues of power, issues of oppression. So speaking of power and oppression, I was wondering if you had any views on the role of media corporations, platforms, tech companies in facilitating or in impeding these kinds of processes. Because one of the things that is discussed from multiple perspectives and disciplinary outlooks today is the way that platforms are governed and the rules of engagement, if I may say. So I was just wondering if you had any insights on the ways that the work and the position and the powers and the function of these actors, and by actors I mean the large media corporations, have on processes of identity formation, contestation, resistance, resilience, activism of digital religious minorities.
Yeah, this is a very important question. And of course, we always have to remember in media studies and also related studies that when we talk about big corporations that govern the internet, those are all for-profit corporations that at the end, they want to create attention, they want to create engagement, to push products, to push advertising, to push basically attention to something. So when people register on Facebook, usually there is a disclaimer coming out and saying, Facebook is free and you will never be asked to pay for it. But actually people do pay for Facebook. They pay with their own data, they pay with their own the advertising they consume, because clearly Facebook makes their revenues from ad banners and sponsored content. And this is the logic that governs all of the internet. And we may like it or not, but the internet is basically a for-profit, or at least social media are governed by for-profit companies. So when there is criticism to how social media is structured, we also have to remember that Google, Meta, which is the company that acquired Facebook and Instagram, among others, Twitter, which was recently acquired by Elon Musk, they do not have any aim of promoting equality or advancing the public good, but they do have in mind basically just to make some profit, as every other company from Coca-Cola to McDonald's would do, right? So there's not really much of an idea of creating a structure that would give a voice to the marginalized people. However, clearly, there are some mechanisms that also marginalized people can use at their advantage. So clearly, stories that are very visual, very engaging, that can create debate and maybe are also controversial, they tend to get more attention. However, the people that get really successful online are usually the people that can understand the logics of social media, and each platform can have different logic. So I'm taking the example of Instagram, which is one of the main platforms that are used by younger generations. In order to engage people on Instagram, it's important to create posts that are both personal, that have a good visual outlook, that they usually combine text and visual, and can either contain pictures, but also now Instagram stories are becoming increasingly popular, so that they contain short videos, usually with subtitles, so people can listen to them, basically. A lot of people have been using this sort of idea at their advantage. And for instance, various Muslim women living in Europe and the US became popular on Instagram as well as YouTube, creating hijab tutorials. So showing people how to wrap up their heads and in general doing fashion tutorials. Now, Instagram is a platform where everything visual, everything fashion, everything connected to clothes or accessories can actually get a big following. And some of those women also started their own brands and really became popular and started to do, featured content and sponsored products. What is interesting, however, is that even though most of those accounts did not have a strong religious content, it also became a way to discuss Islam in a different way. So we know that in a lot of contexts, Muslim women, especially when we talk, for instance, about Europe, Muslim women are not very much listened to, especially when they wear a veil, because there is this general idea that they do not have much agency, and they tend to be oppressed, quote unquote, by their partners or their families. But through a platform such as Instagram or YouTube, those women, or at least some of them, have become able to also discuss their own viewpoints. So a study that I conducted in 2016, when France banned the so-called burkini, which was a swimsuit worn specifically by Muslim women or other women who would follow religious modesty. A lot of so-called influencers or other women who online were active in talking about hijab, tutorials, and fashion, they also became very vocal in defending the rights of dressing the way they wanted, and denouncing how this ban was discriminatory and was even against the feminist principle that each woman should wear what she wants without someone or a state or a city hall dictating to her what she wanted to wear.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the logic of the platform that really invites people to talk about clothes and to have visual posts or visual videos was used also to convey a religious message, discussing how and why people would veil, and what is the role of Islam in European societies and how certain people, especially women, might feel marginalized by being part of a minority group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is interesting is that some Muslim influencers who are active on Instagram are starting now to remove their veils. And so they're bringing up new conversations about how they are still Muslim, but they no longer want to wear a veil. And this, it's an interesting phenomenon because it attracts a lot of critiques from other Muslims saying, well, you are just following again the commercial logics and they're doing something that brings you more attention and brings more attention to your page because you get more likes and more followings if you are no longer veiled. But there is also a lot of support, a lot of other Muslim women saying, well, you just gave me courage to decide that I want to live my religion in a different way, that I want to no longer wear a certain attire, or that Islam for me means something different.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting how at the end fashion becomes such a powerful way of also conveying religious messages and religious discussions. And in the end, platforms like Instagram does not invite religious conversations, but by using fashion, which is something very popular on Instagram, it's also possible to discuss religion.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that we've covered quite some ground, and I could spend equal amounts of time, if not more, asking you more questions. But at this point, I think it's best to thank you for your time, for your valuable explanations, but thank also the viewers for their time spent watching this, and mention that we will have, as a very last point, the opportunity to work with you in the context of a special issue that we are preparing on from a variety of disciplinary outlooks on what digital religion does to religious minorities and vice versa. So there will be more of your very interesting thoughts included in that project. And once again, for more interesting information of what the ECMI does, please follow us on our social media and visit our website at www.ecmi.de, and stay tuned for our next episode. And until then, goodbye.